The machine never stopped, not for weekends, not for holidays, not for the night. Inside the JVC manufacturing complex in Yokohama, Japan, the magnetic tape coating lines ran continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year, because stopping them cost more than running them. The chemistry didn't like to be interrupted, the machines didn't like to be cold, and the world was consuming videotape at a rate that made stopping unthinkable. In the 1980s, the VHS cassette was the infrastructure of home entertainment. Not a product. Infrastructure. The way roads are infrastructure, or electrical grids, or water pipes, the VHS tape was the invisible system through which an entire culture moved its stories from one place to another. 1 billion cassettes were manufactured in the peak years of the format. 1 billion. Each, one containing a magnetic tape precisely 12.65 millimeters wide, wound onto plastic reels inside a black shell, coated with iron oxide particles aligned in a specific direction by a magnetic field applied during the manufacturing process. Each one made in a factory that never slept. This is what that factory looked like from the inside. The format war that preceded the VHS era is well known. JVC's VHS against Sony's Betamax, two incompatible systems competing for the right to become the standard home video format from the mid-1970s onward. Betamax arrived first in 1975, VHS followed in 1976. Betamax was technically superior in several respects, better picture quality, more compact cassette design. But VHS had something Betamax didn't. Recording time. The first VHS cassettes could record 2 hours of content. The first Betamax cassettes could record 1 hour. In America in 1976, the average football game was 3 hours long. Betamax couldn't record a football game. VHS could. The format war was not decided by engineers. It was decided by the length of American football games. JVC licensed the VHS format aggressively to other manufacturers. Panasonic, Hitachi, Sharp, RCA, building a coalition of producers that Betamax could not match. By 1980, VHS held more than 70% of the American market. By 1984, it was effectively over. Sony conceded in 1988 and began making VHS players. The winning format went to its factories and began producing tape at a scale the world had never seen for a consumer recording medium. The tape itself began with a substrate, a base film of polyester plastic, typically 12 to 23 microns thick, wound onto large supply reels. The polyester base was not magnetic. It was simply the carrier, the road on which the recording would travel. The magnetic particles were in the coating that went on top of it. The coating was a suspension of gamma ferric oxide, iron oxide, particles in a solvent-based binder. The iron oxide particles were needle-shaped, each one roughly a fraction of a micron long. Under a microscope, the uncoated suspension looked like a dark brown liquid. Under a much more powerful microscope, you could see the needles. The coating process applied this suspension to the moving polyester base in a layer precisely controlled to a fraction of a micron in thickness. A coating that was too thick would be too rigid and would crack or shed particles during use. A coating that was too thin wouldn't hold enough magnetic information to record a usable image. The tolerance was narrow. It was held by the precision of the coating machine and the consistency of the coating chemistry, both of which had to be maintained continuously without interruption for as long as the run lasted. Immediately after the coating was applied and before it dried, the tape passed through an orientation section. In the orientation section, a strong magnetic field was applied perpendicular to the tape's direction of travel. This field aligned the iron oxide needles. Before orientation, the needles in the coating were randomly distributed, pointing in all directions. After orientation, they all pointed the same way. This was critical. A recording head writes a magnetic signal onto the tape by magnetizing the particles as the tape passes. Particles that were already partially aligned in the direction of the recording field were more magnetically responsive. They could hold a stronger, more coherent signal. Random orientation produced a weaker, noisier recording. Aligned particles produced a cleaner image. The entire purpose of the orientation step, the reason for the magnetic field, for the precise timing for the speed control, was to make the particles listen. After orientation, the coated tape moved into the drying ovens. The drying ovens at the JVC factory were long tunnels heated in zones through which the tape traveled at a controlled speed. The solvent in the binder had to evaporate completely before the tape could be wound. Residual solvent in the wound tape would cause the layers to stick together. A cassette that played once and then fused solid in the mechanism was not useful to anyone. After drying, the tape moved to the calendering section. Calendering was a smoothing process. The coated and dried tape was passed between polished steel rollers under high pressure, compressing the coating to a uniform surface roughness. Surface roughness mattered because the playback head of a VHS player rode on the tape surface without touching it, or rather, touching it as lightly as possible, separated by an air film thinner than the wavelength of light. A rougher surface meant a larger air gap between the head and the tape. A larger air gap meant a weaker signal. Smoother tape meant better contact, better signal, better picture. After calendering, the tape was wound onto large pancake reels, master rolls that held thousands of meters of coated tape. The pancake reels moved to the slitting room. In the slitting room, the wide master roll was cut into the narrow strips that would go into individual cassettes. The slitting blades were maintained to an edge sharpness that left the cut edge clean. No burrs, no loose particles, nothing that would contaminate the recording surface when the tape was wound tight against another layer. The cut tape strips were wound onto hubs, the small plastic spools that sat inside the VHS cassette shell. The winding tension was controlled precisely. Too loose and the tape would spool unevenly, causing tracking problems in the player. Too tight and the tape would stretch, distorting the image. The wound hubs were then loaded into the cassette shells. The shells were injection molded polystyrene, top and bottom halves that snapped together around the two reels of tape. Inside the shell, a leader tape was spliced to the beginning of the magnetic tape. The leader was a clear plastic strip, not magnetic, not recordable, that protected the beginning of the tape from the mechanical stress of loading and unloading in the player. The leader splice had to hold. A splice that failed in a player would jam the mechanism and destroy the tape. Workers at the loading stations performed the splice by hand, using a splicing block and adhesive tape strips. Thousands of splices per shift, each one the same, each one inspected. After loading, the cassette was assembled. The shell halves were joined. The protective door, the sliding flap that covered the tape opening and only retracted when the cassette was inserted into a player, was fitted and tested. The cassette was turned over and the reel lock tested. The reel lock engaged when the cassette was not in a player, preventing the reels from spinning and the tape from loosening. A cassette whose reel lock failed would arrive at a customer with loose tape spilling out of the shell. Each completed cassette was tested for function. The reels turned freely, the door opened and closed, the reel lock engaged and released. Then it went to the bulk erasing station, a high-frequency magnetic field that wiped any residual signal from the tape, ensuring the customer received a blank, rather than whatever random magnetic noise the tape had accumulated during manufacturing. Then labeling, then boxing. Then into the supply chain that delivered blank VHS cassettes to every electronics store, every supermarket, every gas station convenience store, every mail order catalog in the world. The factories that made VHS tape ran continuously because the demand never stopped. The video rental industry consumed tape at rates that required factories to operate without interruption. A video rental store might stock thousands of titles, each title on multiple cassettes. Each cassette wore out. When a cassette wore out, it was replaced. The replacement came from a factory that had been running since before the worn-out cassette was made and would still be running after it was replaced. Peak production of VHS tape occurred in the mid to late 1980s. The dominant manufacturer was not JVC, but Maxell, TDK, and BASF. Companies that had been making magnetic tape for audio applications since the 1960s and had converted their facilities and their chemistry to videotape as the format grew. Then the DVD arrived. In 1998 in North America, the DVD didn't replace VHS immediately. For several years, both formats coexisted. But the direction was clear to anyone who looked at the numbers. The tape coding lines that had never stopped began to slow. First, the night shifts were reduced. Then the weekend runs were curtailed. Then machines that had run continuously for 15 years were powered down. The chemistry that didn't like to be interrupted was interrupted, and the machines went cold and they didn't go back on. The last VHS cassette was manufactured in 2016 by a Japanese company called Funai Electric, the last manufacturer still producing the format. Funai cited declining sales and the difficulty of procuring the precision components required for production. The tape coding lines at Funai's factory were switched off for the final time. The machines went cold. After 30 years of continuous operation, the thing that had never stopped,